Thank you so much, Peter. A warm and welcoming introduction. Let me distribute this handout, which I'll invoke at a couple points in my talk, my remarks. I apologize for my very, very limited knowledge of French. And I do want to encourage you to interrupt me at any point. And of course, more particularly to think about what I have to say in terms of the French experience. The issues that I will discuss and the examples that I will provide mostly come from my own country, the United States, although some of them will be drawn from international law as well. And occasionally, in the book that this is part of, I draw on the law of other countries. But France in particular is not a place that I've thought about these issues in relation to, and so I welcome you to do so, those of you especially who may have had a chance to read the paper in advance. Okay, so over recent years, a recurrent leitmotif of public discourse, in my country at least, has been the concern that American society increasingly risks a sort of coming apart, in the words of Charles Murray, a leading influential political analyst. Several statistical indices of social and psychological dysfunction suggest a serious danger of what we might loosely call a societal unraveling. This sense of unraveling found powerful reflection, I think you will have noticed, in the intensity of the political polarization during our recent American electoral process. Now, one aspect of these concerns, important if largely implicit, is the particular risk that I want to focus on today. That the law, in its unexamined reliance at key points on what I'll call common morality, what ordinary people regard as right and wrong, what elicits their indignation at perceived injustice, that common morality will prove unwarranted for law to rely on it, that the law will therefore need to intercede more aggressively in a number of domains where private ordering is now found wholly unsatisfactory, and that this aggressive intervention will be a risky step, posing new dangers, new risks of its own. Now, the law lets us do many things, I think you'll agree, that most people deem contemptible. Americans may speak publicly in outrageously offensive ways under the rights of our First Amendment to our Constitution. Soldiers within international law are permitted to kill innocent civilians under certain circumstances. Rich museums may retain artwork stolen from poor countries. The mentally retarded may bear multiple children. Women, and I draw from all areas of legal life here, by the way, and I'm not referring, I should clarify in particular, to my own moral views at any point. I'm concerned with common morality, what empirical evidence suggests most people think justice requires, or what elicits their indignation, regardless of whether they're right or wrong on the merits. In the US, women may abort pregnancies, terminate pregnancies, simply because they find the timing inconvenient for a planned vacation. Rights to do serious wrong often arise when lawmakers tacitly trust in everyday ethics to govern our conduct satisfactorily, to ensure, in other words, that these kinds of events don't happen very much. But on this basis, this reliance on common morality, this tacit trust that lawmakers repose in it, legislators and judges decline to mandate further responsibilities that they assume that we, as parents, soldiers, whatever, bankers, that we will undertake freely without need for the law to require these duties of us. Now, the fact that law could put so much confidence in common morality alarms many legal theorists who see ethical error all around us and believe that the law must set things aright. And yet, though reliance on folk sentiment is risky, calamitously so at times, no doubt, it's unavoidable and frequently desirable, I believe. But to know whether and when this confidence of law in common morality, whether it's warranted, requires that we carefully examine the informal practices people employ to discourage or resist those who exercise their rights in ways widely regarded as irresponsible, abusive, indefensible. This job of empirical scrutiny is uniquely suited to sociology, I think, not philosophy or economics. the two disciplines currently most curious about the relation between law and morals. Such a sociology must identify what Montesquieu called the reigning mores of an age, their shifting contours over time, and how successfully they inhibit disfavored conduct, both across society at large and, no less importantly, within discrete vocational milieu. For its social mores, I think, with a defiant life of their own, independent of the law very often, that chiefly govern the ordinary behavior through which prevailing notions of right and wrong routinely restrain perceived misconduct, impropriety, individual and institutional as well. And neither elegant philosophical argument nor refined judicial reasoning really teaches us anything about this elusive yet indispensable process. To defend these claims, I have to show how that process plays out across a broad sweep of legal life. And the book from which these pages are drawn uses examples from, as I've said, American, foreign, and international law. Law on matters as far afield as personal bankruptcy, which I'll mention in a moment, physician-patient relations, multinational investment, home insurance, a topic in which students of risk, I should think, have some interest, collective bargaining, the regulation of Wall Street, and microlending in the global South. In these and other situations, it's only because a prudent deference to common morality has decisively constrained the way we exercise our rights, we actually exercise our rights, put them to use, that we possess many of these rights at all, including some of our most cherished and celebrated freedoms. What then happens, you naturally ask, when, as many now fear, we may no longer so casually rely on common morality to tamp large swaths of lawful wrongdoing, We would inevitably need to revise major features of our legal system, right, upon assumptions less hopeful, less ingenuous, forcing the law to go it alone, a daunting and dangerous step at times. So in this effort to update Montesquieu, which is how I understand this project, I want to show how we can sometimes dexterously manage the inevitable tension between contemporary law and mores, subtly coax them into a felicitous mutual accommodation at times. So let me begin, oh, that's very abstract. Let me begin now with a very concrete example. Consider the law of personal bankruptcy. Though it entitles us to absolve our debts, both lawmakers and the general public, in the US at least, remain ambivalent over whether people should feel entirely comfortable about doing so. We thus grant a right whose exercise, we know, carries a certain aura of stigma. We don't like to admit to stigmatizing other people, of course, and yet we don't wish to entirely dispel such stigma here. In fact, we may welcome the feelings of shame that stigma will induce in some such people, even at this already stressful moment in their lives, undoubtedly. For we suspect that these moral sentiments of stigma and shame will discourage the right's abuse, the abuse of this particular right, just beginning with this one for now. To be sure, we sincerely believe that people should have the option to go bankrupt when they really, really need it. But we don't want them to believe too readily that they need it. See what I mean? And so we suspect that we cannot draft the law so perfectly as to prevent that danger from materializing, more than occasionally, at least. So it's situations like this that interest me, and they arise all across the panorama of legal life. So at such points within our legal system, just taking that example for now, there's a curious interplay that develops between a very lenient law and a more censorious public morality, which we depend on to dampen the law's use, a dampening that we often have as lawyers, at least vaguely in mind, even as we devise the law's terms in anticipation of how often and by whom it will actually be employed, the rights that it creates. This general configuration of ample rights joined to stigmatizing restraints recurs in patterned ways, I think, at various points across the legal landscape. And that's what I'm trying to theorize in this book. We nonetheless sometimes remain sheepish, as I admitted a moment ago, about admitting our practices here, with the result that stigma, as a mechanism for rights restraint, is unduly, well, stigmatized. Why do we do things this way in any event? Why do we knowingly establish legal entitlements considerably broader than the conduct we're actually prepared to countenance? Does this mean that even those rights we regard as most central to our democratic way of life, to engage in offensive political speech, for instance, we Americans, that is, do these rights turn out to depend for their very existence on our expectation that few, if anyone, will ever really invoke them very much? And if so, does that make us hypocrites? If we dismiss these questions, we succumb, I think, to a mystification in defending treasured rights, our First Amendment, for instance, entirely in terms of the high moral principles, Kantian principles of individual autonomy, for instance, that these rules undoubtedly enshrine. For these rights rest at least equally on our tacit sociological assumptions about who will exercise these rights, when, and how frequently, to what ends. These are things that lawyers and law professors don't usually much talk about. A serious challenge for the lawmaker is then that more people may turn up at the door to claim the rights that she has blithely created, but seriously, or I should say secretly, hoped that fewer would actually employ. So informal constraints against what she considers the abuse of rights may prove weaker than anticipated. Another way of stating this observation. The converse, to be sure, is always possible as well. That is, underclaiming can prove no less trouble, underclaiming of rights, no less troubling than overclaiming. But for purposes of this analysis, I'm focusing on overclaiming. These considerations prompt us to wonder then, why does resistance to the exercise of legal rights arise acutely at certain points within a legal system, but not at others? And how does the anticipation of this very resistance come to shape the law itself? These are novel questions, I think, for legal theory. Now, the legal system is only one part of a larger normative order that often stands in tension with the other parts, requiring us to consider their workings too, and their interactions with the law itself. We regularly acknowledge moral duties, no? To refrain from and to discourage in others activities that the law perfectly allows, just as we sometimes feel duties to encourage others' lawful activities that we fear suffer undue impediments. In either case, the law provides an inadequate guide to what we believe that we and others ought to do in the end, in the final analysis. And yet, it's a common pathology, a pathology observed of Americans especially, ever since Tocqueville, to think that the law offers a sufficient basis for prescriptive appraisal of our conduct, what we have done, what we should do. Today, influential work in social science attributes Americans' our increasing reliance on the law in recent decades, attributes it to a decline in social trust, in social capital that permits such trust. Robert Putnam, an influential political scientist, thus contends that, quote, we are forced to rely increasingly on formal institutions, and above all on the law, he writes, to accomplish what we used to accomplish through informal networks, reinforced through generalized social reciprocity, unquote. We should add, though, that social capital of the sort that Putnam has in mind here may moderate not only the invocation of legal rights, social capital also attenuates the uncivil behavior which common morality and the social practices embodying it once suppressed, and that now increasingly inspires us to invoke these very rights. Consider, again, this is all a bit abstract, consider now several brief cases of real-life situations that, where the law is considerably more indulgent, if you will, than is common morality, often in the expectation that potential problems created thereby will resolve themselves extra-legally. Under the label of collateral damage, thousands of innocent civilians may be lawfully killed in combat, provided that those responsible do not intend this result and anticipate that battlefield gains will outweigh such carnage. American law allows us to completely disinherit our children, including young minors, even if they've done nothing to deserve this fate. We may construct buildings on our property that are profoundly offensive to our neighbors. In fact, in some countries, including the US, we may even do such things in order to offend our neighbors. International law allows Western museums to retain masterworks looted long ago from their rightful owners. When we purchase insurance to protect our property, we're free to behave with considerable indifference to safeguarding it from destruction. Moral hazard, it's called. We Americans, at least, may lawfully engage in highly offensive speech, such as denouncing the military's acceptance of homosexuality among the ranks, to take a recent infamous US Supreme Court case. We may decline medical attention. We have the right to do so. There are physicians correctly tell us that we will die promptly otherwise. Any moral obligations we may owe to our children, to our other financial dependents, to ourselves, arguably, find no reflection here in the law. Even when a state, a sovereign state, through its leaders, commits mass atrocity against its own citizens in violation of many international agreements, it retains the right to territorial integrity against so-called humanitarian intervention by force from abroad, an entitlement subject to only the narrowest, very narrowest of exceptions. And this legal right enables the state to successfully perpetrate such atrocities. Another example, in most societies, it's legally permissible to terminate a pregnancy on the grounds that the child would be a girl. This is true even in most Western countries, with substantial immigration from parts of the world where sex-selective abortion is very common, despite good reason, in other words, to suspect that the practice continues in the recipient countries. In my country, the US, an adult woman may employ abortion as a means of birth control for no other reason than that she and her sexual partner find contraception unpleasant or unburdensome. These illustrations, very far afield, of course, have something crucial in common. The law permits what ordinary morality, widely shared norms of right and wrong, among large portions of the population at least, severely reproaches. The cases also suggest that extra-legal mechanisms often limit how extensively and in what manner we put such rights to use, so that a number of these illustrations that I've given don't, in fact, we like to think, we hope, occur very often. What do we learn from these mechanisms? All this suggests that they're extra-legal mechanisms, again, limiting how often we use the rights in these morally contemptible ways, or what, again, most people would regard as contemptible. And so what do we learn from the mechanisms that restrain the exercise of rights in these objectionable ways? About the incidence of these mechanisms and their explanation, about the character of law itself, for that matter, as one mode of governance among others, fully intelligible only in its workaday relations with these alternatives to law. The illustrations I've offered differ greatly in many respects, of course. The conduct involved in each is objectionable to different people in different ways, to be sure. Also distinctive to each such form of disfavored conduct is the mix of reasons why the law permits it. In seeking to constrain such behavior, we succeed in varying degree, very different degree, that is, in some cases almost entirely, in others scarcely at all. From each situation to the next, we also employ very different methods, some coercive, some consensual, in restraining the conduct that's considered objectionable. Many of our means to this end are readily apparent to any observer. Others are known only to institutional insiders, invisible to the uninitiated, requiring often some forms of ethnographic inquiry. My general point here, though, the most basic assertion here is simply that there exists an entire class of such entitlements, and it's useful to think of them under this single category as having these features in common, notwithstanding their many differences. These are rights that we at once deeply enshrine within our law, yet actively, even aggressively at times, discourage one another from exercising. We are often sincere and perfectly justified in regarding them as important to protect these rights through legal rules sometimes grounded in high constitutional or humanitarian principle. We nonetheless treat such rights as advisable to frustrate at nearly every turn. We recoil especially at the possibility of facilitating their widespread usage beyond a very restricted set of circumstances, which the law cannot adequately define or delimit. Many feel ambivalent, even deeply troubled in recognizing these rights at all. It's therefore unsurprising then that though they may endure for long periods, some of them, these entitlements occasionally face strong challenge and regularly dissolve. It's only the category of such rights, of rights to do serious wrong, as I call them, that endures. Its dynamics, its presuppositions regarding informal pushback, if you will. It's not the particular contents of that category of rights to do wrong over time that's constant. Despite our persistent doubts about such rights, we generally act in good conscience, in other words, and on defensible grounds in establishing them. For we have reasons to believe that various social mechanisms will press upon people and institutions as well to exercise these rights responsibly, as people often say, attending, that is, to moral considerations that the law itself cannot fully absorb. We may regret that it proves impossible to devise a legal rule clearly, precisely distinguishing prohibited from permitted conduct, enabling the law to more perfectly track, follow, jot for jot, the terms of common morality. And yet, for practical purposes, this slippage becomes immaterial because we're confident that forces within society, speaking loosely, using that as a placeholder for the moment, will close the gap. So this socio-legal configuration, as we might call it, I think it arises with some regularity, and hence the variety of the situations from which I'm drawing examples. Why it arises where it does is a part of the book I'm not going to talk about in my talk, but welcome questions if you want to go into that. So this configuration, its distinct mix of figures, may not be readily or immediately recognizable, I admit, nor readily intelligible, for that matter. And so it presents a puzzle that, at some level, everyone has at least casually encountered, I suspect. It arises not only in weighty matters of global and national concern, but in ordinary lives. We often encounter it whenever we find ourselves wondering why our legal system allows conduct by others, individuals and institutions, eliciting within us powerful indignation at perceived injustice. The tacit compromise and effective equilibrium between a lenient law and a more stringent morality is often defensible for long periods to virtually all concerned. And it was, as I said, Montesquieu who offered the first sustained analysis, of course, of the relations between law and mores, which he took to mean widespread everyday social practices embodying prevailing moral sensibilities. Taking Montesquieu loosely as my guide here, let me sketch out a few other possibilities, and I've identified on this handout. Imagine this 2x2 table with two axes identified as, first, the possibility, and second, the necessity of legally codifying a moral norm, a norm of common morality. The first quadrant, number one, where it's both possible and necessary for the law to step in and supplement weak norms of common morality, there's no problem here. The law can fill the breach, in other words, where informal norms fail to regulate conduct satisfactorily. The second quadrant, we can discuss examples later if you like. Second quadrant, here it's impossible but also unnecessary that the law assume an active role in normative ordering, because common morality is at work in successfully moderating the exercise of rights that are, on their face, overbroad. Collateral damage in war, some would say, would be an example here. I'll have more to say about that later. There's usually no problem either in the third quadrant, over to the upper right, where it's both possible and unnecessary for the law to intercede. Unnecessary, again, because norms of common morality are well entrenched, effectively dampening abusive exercise of a given right. The only complication here is that if the law does nonetheless interpose itself, it may not necessarily reinforce healthy, salutary norms, but rather crowd them out in the language of economics. That's because there are some salutary activities people will only do spontaneously, of their own free accord, free will, when they don't feel coerced or manipulated through incentives. In this case, legal entrenchment of moral duty is possible, but undesirable. And there's some interesting empirical studies of this phenomenon of crowding out that some of you who have studied economics or psychology may have encountered. I can tell you about them. The serious problems then only arise in quadrant 4, lower left, where legal absorption of a moral norm is both necessary and impossible. Here, informal processes of equilibration between law and morals simply fail. The law cannot effectively intercede to solve critical regulatory problems that everyone acknowledges to exist. At the same time, extra-legal norms prove equally inadequate in addressing them. It's often difficult to know when we face this predicament, and even harder to address it, even if we have recognized it. Situations of this sort may, I hope, spring to your mind readily. One of these near insuperable predicaments may exist, for example, in the very uncertain efforts of the United Nations in recent years to induce greater restraint by multinational corporations operating in poor, politically repressive countries. These are places where national law, or its non-enforcement, often allow such companies to operate at ethical standards well below those imposed by richer democratic countries. Such standards seek to protect labor, the environment, political rights. In the judgment of many, at least, neither these informal norms that the UN has been developing, the so-called global compact regime, nor formal law, of which there's very little at the international level, have here proven entirely satisfactory to the essential regulatory tasks. Some of my case illustrations of rights to do serious wrong do fall felicitously in some of the categories, the quadrants, where social norms fill the regulatory breach left behind by law's limitations. That's the case, for instance, as I mentioned a moment ago, I think, with the right to inflict civilian harm in war, and the right also to decline essential life support in the medical treatment context. I'll say more about that, too, and in questions, I hope. Further legal restriction appears largely unnecessary, undesirable, or impossible. So the social norms, common morality is doing the job satisfactorily, in other words. Stringent normative ordering of some sort, though, does remain necessary, and the reason for laws under-inclusiveness of these moral concerns that people have will vary. It's not something I'm going to talk about except perhaps in questions. If private ordering then proves insufficient at first, as it sometimes does in some of these situations, then very often what social scientists call moral entrepreneurs will go to work, as with, for instance, consumer mobilizations against Bangladeshi sweatshops, for instance, closing the gap, strengthening the power of these dissuasive moral norms without engaging law's formal prohibitions as such. There's some reason for skepticism over whether, in the contemporary West at least, the preservation or creation of an acceptable social order requires any shared non-trivial sense of morality, whether that's necessary. At least since Jeremy Bentham, a widely shared view has been in Western legal and political thought that it does not, that we don't need a common morality. This has been a leitmotif across several competing schools of modern legal and political thought that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Liberal theory, in particular, while directing a steady stream of criticism against particular laws, has virtually never challenged the supposition that the law in general remains our last and best hope of securing a decent society whose members are at least passably happy. Even libertarian forms of liberalism, ever fearful of the state's encroachment beyond its due domain, consistently stress the importance of official protection for the private realm, secured through the law of contract, property, and of the family. No one should deny that there are times when legal rules rightly override prevailing moral sensibilities of a given community, where these threaten vital human interests. The unacceptable standards of common morality may simply be those of an insular sub-community, deviant in respect to the standards within the wider society embodied in its law. Such is the case, for instance, in my country with members of a religious group called the Jehovah's Witnesses, whose adult members regularly refuse to allow their children to receive blood transfusions essential to the child's survival. From this standpoint, the question becomes then, when, if ever, is it defensible and desirable for the law to place so much reliance on something so questionable, ephemeral, ethereal, as extra-legal morality, common morality, over which the law retains so little control, inevitably. Whether that morality is of a given subcommunity or of the general population, the concern may be equally acute. Now, this formulation immediately invites objections, I recognize. It's one that anyone but a law professor would regard as megalomania on our part. From any other perspective than a law professor, in other words, the opposite question would surely seem more compelling, no? What portion of the larger normative order in a society and its enforcement ought to be entrusted to the legal system and those claiming professional authority to administer it, not rather what exceptions should the law allow to common morality. At this point, skeptics of policy reliance on common morality will inevitably insist on dredging up the familiar story about how modernity has fatally eroded the social foundations of any meaningful measure of common morality at all. Such critics will claim that there's no reason to believe that the little clans and insular coteries examined in a number of empirical microethnographies in which it's shown that common morality does most of the regulation, the normative ordering, that these represent something more than themselves, isolated instances, that they offer anything of a larger explanatory lessons. If the efficacy of modern law really rests on any robust sense then of widely shared morals, then we are doomed, according to these theorists who say that common morality just doesn't exist. There's something about the nature of modernity that underrides it. This aspect of modernity the particular aspect of modernity, I should say, deemed responsible for this plight, this weakening of the common morality on which it's long thought that social order depended, varies depending on your taste in social theory, of course. It stretches from a concern with secularization and spiritual disenchantment. Well, that's what theologians and conservative culture critics say. Alienation by the capitalist cash nexus under Marxist analysis, to anomie and atomization, Durkheim, of course, bureaucratic rationalization, instrumental reason, panoptical surveillance, whatever. Their differences notwithstanding, all these accounts of man's fate under modernity make it difficult, if not impossible, to maintain that any genuine form of common morality, consensually adopted, widely shared, voluntarily embraced, could conceivably exert any significant restraint on how we think and act in exercising our legal rights. The echoes of such morality, in other words, if they were ever truly existed at all, have grown so faint, and the social mechanisms by which they regulate are simply too feeble for the law to regard with any respect and deference. It's often immaterial, though, whether an entire national society does or doesn't come under the strong influence of a single coherent common morality, the sort contemplated by Durkheim, who I think taught here for some years, or the early American socio-legal scholars. The opposite question, rather, is more simply whether a given morality is shared by sufficient numbers of pertinent people in the right places so that their activities may be regulated with legal rules that work in reliance on those shared moral intuitions, shared moral sentiments, in kind of congenial conjunction with common morality, kind of common morality. The relevant people often do not constitute society at large, the kind of common morality that Durkheim, of course, had in mind, although it's sometimes the case, but rather, more often, those people who occupy very particular places within society, from the divorcing parents of young children, for instance, an example I talk about in the book, or to members of distinct vocational groups, such as physicians and military officers, examples I'll discuss in a moment. How does modernity affect the relations, then, between law and common morality, if it doesn't completely destroy common morality? Social pressures are very real against the exercise of rights that are regarded as disfavored. And these pressures regularly arise from sources that are not traditional, but quite modern, novel in historical terms, inspired, for instance, by principles of international human rights, very often. And the contemporary methods of pushback against the exercise of disfavored rights, methods for moralizing a conflict, converting it from a technical or scientific idiom of understanding into a more overtly normative one. These methods are no more conservative than the aspirations of people who are involved. And so there's nothing particularly politically valenced one way or another about this argument. So the agents of common morality regularly find ways, sometimes through the latest in new media, social media of course, to veritably shout from the rooftops the kinds of restraints they want to put on the exercise of legal rights by people who have them, and sometimes to great effect, with great effectiveness. When legislators and judges in such societies liberalize the law, make it more philosophically liberal, they deflate the law's aspirations to govern certain areas of conduct which they decide to consider purely private, personal. If still wrongful, perhaps, in the judgment of very, very many people. And so the progressive liberal retraction of law's reach by designating ever broader swaths of social life as exclusively private is a defining feature of liberal modernity. That's true. And yet, as the law follows this trajectory of retreat ever further, those so governed find themselves compelled, paradoxically, to pay ever closer attention to how dependent the public realm, law's preoccupation, becomes for its satisfactory functioning on extra-legal practice by which common morality is increasingly sustained. In this sense, then, common morality becomes ever more important over time in a modern society in governing how we moderns exercise our legal rights in ways affecting interests and ideals still very much of acute public concern. Liberal modernity does not entail law's linear retreat from the incorporation of enforcement of common morality. Rather, there are conflicting pressures at once in both directions, retreat and advance. Sometimes when what the law once treated as a matter of public concern will now be left to unofficial mechanisms of moral ordering. Conversely, common morality at times shifts in ways prompting the law's bold advances into issue areas hitherto left to the workings of precisely these informal forces. And at these points, lawmakers have come to believe that private ordering restrains the exercise of legal rights in morally unacceptable ways. The second type of change, to offer a concrete example, is apparent in how American law, like that of most Western societies, now limits the scope of medical paternalism by physicians. In its most extreme form, medical paternalism entailed a normative stance authorizing the physician to act on the patient's best interests, as the physician understood it, with limited regard for what the patient herself desired. Ever since the Hippocratic Oath in ancient Greece, at least, the medical profession has valorized the patient's physical survival above all else, in the face even of imminent death or permanent unendurable pain. This stance left medical professionals and their personnel with little opportunity or authorization to acknowledge a patient's moral claims to self-determination, to enact her own conception of the good life, increasingly understood to include a right to end it. Lawmakers stood largely aside for a long time in deference to claims of scientific authority, then understood and then considered unassailable. Starting only in the 1970s, did courts in my country and legislators too start seriously to reassess this position, by which the law accorded a certain deference to the common morality of the profession of medicine, predicated on this notion of the Hippocratic Oath and saving life at all cost. So invoking the public's evolving moral sensibilities on these issues in their defense, lawmakers began to interject the law into the domain of physician-patient relations, once considered an essentially private affair, despite the state's increasing role in financing the entire healthcare system. Along similar lines, we may describe the changing relationship throughout the world between professional soldiers and their fellow citizens. For centuries, the normative ordering of relations between officers and civilians in war remained effectively in charge to the profession of arms itself. interstate treaties and governing the conduct of armed conflict did not exist until the late 19th century. And customary law was only somewhat more developed, with very limited purchase upon military practice in any event, as best we can tell. Soldiers and statesmen did not regard common moral understandings, those of civilians that is, on either side of the battle lines as remotely relevant to the normative regulation of war. As such ordering remained entirely an in-house affair among military elites. It's hardly surprising that these hereditary aristocrats who ruled politics at a time lacking any full adult franchise even, displayed only the most minimal and chivalric of moral sensitivities toward the fate of those whose suffering they caused, effectively, the horrors of war. Even the first Hague and Geneva Conventions, for that matter, bore a heavy stamp of the self-interested influence of a pan-European officer corps, its own internal common morality, common to this class. And that required then only much later the intercession of concerned civilians, not military officers at all, beginning in the late 1880s with Henri Dunant's agony over the thousands he viewed dying on the battlefield of Solferino, to press the law more generally towards some faint acknowledgement of the legitimate place of common morality, the normative intuitions of most people, and to inject those into the international governance of war, the law of war. So, in sum, both medical and military professions traditionally laid very broad claims to self-governance, a kind of internal nomos, if you will, a normative universe of their own, governing their own activities, and the social authority within that domain, on the basis of practices of moral ordering heavily private in nature and owing little to any formal legal limits. Nor did prevailing moral sensibilities among broader publics yet exercise great influence over how these professionals went about their work in practice. Only much, much later, at the initiative of skeptical outsiders, outside the medical profession, outside the military vocation, would a wider sense of common morality enshrined in reformed find their way into a reformed set of legal rules and come increasingly to infuse the activities of these professions in real life. Through the later versions of the Geneva Conventions, for instance, or treaties on particular weapon systems prohibiting anti-personnel landmines in particular. These were not initiatives that came from within the normative universe of the military elite. And so in both of these cases that I've sketched only very briefly, of course, physicians and soldiers, traditional practices of moral ordering embodied views today that we deem illiberal, pre-modern, anti-modern even. And in both cases, those practices originated in very particularistic norms of men occupying high social stature afforded by membership within an elite profession of ancient pedigree, of course. Today, we might forgive the unpalatable historical origins of these practices of private ordering if they still seemed at least to deliver on their promise in ways that liberal legality could not. We might be prepared, in other words, to live with the embarrassing illiberal nature of these restraints on their exercise of their rights if they show themselves effective, at least, in inducing physicians and professional soldiers to exercise their rights responsibly, sufficiently so, as we would now understand and apply that concept of responsibility to their activities. There's otherwise no reason for the law to continue affording the members of these various vocations any rights to cause serious harm in ways that so many consider wrongful. These prominently include those rights authorizing soldiers to incidentally, that's the legal term of art, incidentally kill civilians in war, and rights permitting physicians, for much of Western history, to override the wish of a dying patient to end an unbearable existence. At present, more problematic than the illiberal nature of these restraints on exercise of rights, this illiberalism that such practices manifest, may be simply their weakness, their declining capacity to restrain disfavored rights to the extent they once seemingly did. So in short, modern society turns increasingly to the formalities of the law, both national and international, for its chief methods of normative ordering, because we no longer trust such professional groups and other insular subcommunities to regulate themselves in ways sufficiently attentive to expectations of common morals. More telling, though, for present purposes, I think, is that despite the increased legal scrutiny on such professions, contemporary Western society continues to depend at key points on these ancient forms of extra-legal ordering, including in relation to these very professions. I can say more about that. And though recent changes in the law of the sort that I've mentioned governing each of these groups draw our greater attention, surely, more decisive, I think, in sociological terms and less often noticed, is what remains almost untouched. And thus, precisely as we enhance the rights of medical patients vis-a-vis physicians and those who treat them, we at times increasingly depend on such caregivers to actively restrain and essentially prevent these very patients from exercising their new legal right to die. And I'll explain that in a minute, cases, situations where that arise. So we pride ourselves on creating this modern right, the right to end your own life, publicly trumpeting it as a triumph of philosophic liberalism, even as we routinely violate it in service of older ethical understandings, duties to self, duties to others that the law does not enshrine, to dependents, for instance. And that these understandings are still prevalent within society at large, no less than among medical professionals themselves. I speak, for instance, of a kind of situation where someone shows up in an emergency room at a hospital who has no terminal condition, no long-standing situation or medical diagnosis that would lead anyone to expect his death, except that he's undergoing some imminent crisis that would cause his death unless he were treated immediately. So there's no terminal condition that provides the background. There's simply a crisis of some sort that requires immediate intervention by physicians, and he or she declines the treatment, ensuring his death. The law requires that the medical professions respect that right, allow him essentially to kill himself by declining medical treatment, even though he would survive. And yet professional physicians and medical staff intercede against his legal rights, or right up to the point of violating them, at very least, in order to ensure that he or she doesn't exercise that right. So it's restraints of common morality in the sense that this is simply a wrong, not merely irrational, but wrong thing for someone to do that really explains what happens, the results in these situations, in these cases. And this is something that's not very much written about in the medical ethics literature because it essentially involves acknowledging, I'm sorry, I'm speaking too quickly, essentially involves acknowledging that physicians are disobeying the law, not respecting the rights of patients to decline medical treatment. Okay, so, right. Informal restraints of the sorts of all this kind, and that's an example, of sorts on rights to do wrong, become important in a new way, I want to argue, as modern legality retreats, as it ceases to lend coercive backing to a panorama of moral responsibilities that these extra legal restraints now alone underwrite, like those of the medical professionals I was just mentioning. And yet, philosophical defenders of modernity and of liberal legality remain, on the whole, curiously indifferent, I think, even actively suspicious of these social mechanisms and the conditions of their satisfactory operations that keep us from exercising our rights in some situations where such exercise would violate common morality. These modernist thinkers, sympathetic to liberalism, to most understandings of modernity, assume, insofar as the question even crosses their minds, that we may take the continued efficacy of these unspoken forces, these social practices, these mores, for granted. And yet, I think you may agree that many people today would infer from our recent experience with several of the sorts of legal rights that I've mentioned, at least in passing, that within certain pockets of modern society, at least in patterned and predictable ways, we can no longer make such assumptions about the efficacy of common morality to restrain rights, to ensure that they're exercised in ways that most people deem responsible, acceptable. Thank you. Okay.